Is there a reason you're ignoring me?
I'm not ignoring you, I'm just eating.
The cafeteria was always loud, but on a Tuesday in October, it felt like a cage. The smell of cheap pizza and stale floor wax hung heavy in the air while hundreds of students sat in their predictable social circles, blissfully unaware that everything was about to fall apart. In the center of the room sat Arthur, a quiet freshman who usually spent his lunch break staring down at a sketchbook, trying to make himself invisible. But invisibility is a luxury you don't get when Marcus decides you are his entertainment for the day. Marcus was a senior who carried himself like he owned the entire zip code, flanked by two followers who mistook his cruelty for leadership. In a single, violent motion, Marcus grabbed Arthur by the back of his hoodie and hurled him onto the center table. Drinks spilled, plastic trays rattled, and the entire room went dead silent. Arthur lay there, gasping for air, his glasses cracked on the floor. Marcus leaned in, laughing, expecting the freshman to plead or cry. But Arthur didn't cry. He looked at the clock on the wall, wiped a smear of orange soda off his face, and said 6 words that made the color drain completely from Marcus's face: "You just broke the wrong watch." Arthur wasn't the kind of kid anyone remembered. He had moved to the district 3 weeks prior, living in a small, worn-down house at the edge of town with his grandfather, Samuel. Samuel was an elderly man who rarely spoke, spent his days tinkering with broken mechanical clocks in his garage, and wore an old leather jacket that smelled of machine oil and rain. Arthur kept to himself because Samuel had given him one strict rule when they arrived in town: never draw attention, never make trouble, and under no circumstances lose the silver pocket watch Arthur wore around his neck. It wasn't an expensive timepiece, the casing was scratched, the glass cracked, and the hand ticked with a heavy, irregular rhythm. To anyone else, it looked like junk. To Arthur, it was the only thing connecting him to a family he barely remembered. When Marcus slammed Arthur onto the table, the silver watch had hit the hard metal edge, snapping its delicate chain and shattering the small glass casing on the polished floor. As Marcus stood over him, soaking in the silence of the crowd, Arthur reached down with trembling hands and picked up the broken pieces. The ticking had stopped. And for the first time since he had arrived at the school, Arthur didn't look terrified. He looked deeply, utterly resigned. Marcus snorted, raising his voice so the whole room could hear. He made a joke about the cheap trash Arthur was wearing around his neck, kicking a piece of the broken glass across the floor. But before his foot even landed back on the linoleum, a low, mechanical hum vibrated from the doorway of the cafeteria. It wasn't a school bell. It wasn't an alarm. It was a dense, metallic pulse that seemed to resonate through the concrete walls. Through the double glass doors at the far end of the hall, 2 men in identical dark gray uniforms walked into the building. They didn't look like school security. They didn't carry batons or radios. They moved with a chilling, synchronized efficiency, their eyes scanning the room without a trace of emotion. One of them held a sleek black device that blinked with a rapid crimson light. Arthur took a deep breath, grabbed his backpack from the floor, and looked directly at Marcus. "If you want to live, you need to run right now." Marcus laughed, but it was hollow. The atmosphere in the room had shifted instantly. The ambient noise of teenagers whispered into absolute silence. The 2 men in gray didn't call out to the principal or order everyone to freeze. The man on the left raised his handheld device, pressed a switch, and every electronic light in the cafeteria flickered out, plunging the vast room into a murky, shadow-filled grayness. "What is this?" Marcus stammered, stepping back. "Is this a joke?" Arthur didn't answer. He turned and bolted toward the kitchen doors. Instantly, the 2 men accelerated. They didn't run like normal people, they moved with an unsettling speed that looked almost mechanical. Panic erupted across the cafeteria as students pushed back their chairs, screaming, scattering toward the exits. But the 2 men weren't interested in the crowd. They were tracking the signal, or rather, the sudden absence of the signal that the broken watch had been broadcasting for 15 years. Marcus stood frozen for a split second, watching the two men effortlessly shove aside a heavy industrial food cart, their eyes locked on the kitchen door where Arthur had disappeared. Realization hit him like a bucket of ice water. Whatever was happening, he was caught in the center of it because he had destroyed that watch. When one of the men in gray turned his gaze toward Marcus, holding up a device that emitted a high-pitched frequency that made Marcus's ears bleed, Marcus didn't think twice. He turned and ran for his life after the freshman. The industrial kitchen was a maze of stainless steel tables, hanging pots, and steam-filled dishwashing stations. Arthur sprinted through the swinging doors, ducking under a rack of metal trays. Behind him, the heavy double doors were ripped off their hinges with a deafening crash. Marcus burst into the kitchen a second later, terror stripping away every inch of his usual swagger. "Who are those guys?" he yelled, his voice cracking as he caught up to Arthur near the rear loading dock. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Arthur shouted back, straining to push open a heavy steel security door. "You broke the dampener. My grandfather told me if that watch ever stopped ticking, they would find the signal in less than 2 minutes." "Who is they?" Before Arthur could answer, the wall next to the security door buckled outward. One of the gray-suited men rammed through the drywall, grabbing Marcus by the shoulder. Marcus screamed, striking out wildly, but the man's grip was like an iron vice. Suddenly, a loud metallic crack echoed through the kitchen. A heavy iron pipe slammed into the side of the attacker's head. The man stumbled back, releasing Marcus. Standing there, breathing heavily with a steel wrench in his hand, was Samuel. Arthur's grandfather didn't look like an old clockmaker anymore. His eyes were cold, sharp, and commanding. He was wearing his oil-stained jacket, but underneath it was a thick tactical vest fitted with strange, custom-built tools. "Grandpa!" Arthur gasped. "Get behind me, kid," Samuel said, his voice dropping into an authoritative tone Arthur had never heard before. Samuel looked at Marcus, then back at Arthur. "Why is he with you?" "He's the reason it broke," Arthur said. Samuel gave Marcus a brief, terrifying glance that made the senior shrink into himself. "Well," Samuel grunted, "looks like you just got dragged into a war, kid. Keep up or get left behind." Samuel pulled a small metallic sphere from his vest, threw it onto the floor, and smashed it with his boot. A dense, brilliant cloud of white smoke erupted, blinding the kitchen and filling the air with a static charge that fried the tracking devices of the gray-suited men. "To the van, now," Samuel ordered. They scrambled out the loading dock and burst into the bright afternoon sunlight. Parked in the alley behind the school gym was Samuel's faded blue delivery van. They dove into the back just as Samuel slammed his foot on the accelerator, screeching out of the parking lot as police sirens began to wail in the distance. Inside the back of the van, the silence was suffocating. Marcus sat crouched on a pile of spare tires, trembling violently, staring at Arthur and Samuel as if they were aliens. "Okay, look, I won't say anything, I swear," Marcus pleaded, holding his hands up. "Just drop me off at the gas station. I don't know what's going on, I don't care, just let me go." Samuel glanced in the rearview mirror. "If I drop you off now, boy, those men will find you in 20 minutes. They don't leave witnesses. When you broke that watch, you tied your signature to Arthur's location. They think you're part of this." Marcus looked at Arthur, his chest heaving. "Part of what? What are you people?" Arthur sat in the corner, staring down at the shattered pieces of the silver watch in his hands. "I don't know," Arthur said softly, his voice trembling. "He never told me." Samuel sighed, turning the van onto a secluded dirt road that led deep into the surrounding woodland. "It's time I told you the truth, Arthur. I promised your mother I'd wait until you were 18, but we don't have the luxury of time anymore." Samuel explained that 15 years ago, he wasn't a clockmaker. He was the head researcher for a covert private contractor known as the Meridian Directive. They were working on advanced signal tracking and surveillance technology, Systems capable of predicting human movement and locating individuals anywhere on Earth using unique bioelectric signatures. When Samuel discovered the organization intended to use the technology to hunt down and eliminate political dissidents, whistleblowers, and innocent families, he tried to shut it down. But Meridian was too powerful. To protect Arthur, who had been born with a rare medical condition that made his bioelectric signature uniquely distinct and easily trackable, Samuel stole the prototype dampener, the silver watch. He faked their deaths, went into hiding, and spent 15 years moving from town to town, living like a ghost. "The men in gray aren't police," Samuel said grimly as the van bounced over rough terrain. "They are Meridian's extraction unit. And now that the watch is dead, every satellite they control is locked onto this county." Marcus sank back against the spare tires, putting his head in his hands. "This isn't real. This is crazy. I'm just a high school senior. I was supposed to play in the regional football game on Friday." "You should have thought about that before you put your hands on my grandson," Samuel said coldly. "Now sit down and keep quiet." The van pulled up to an abandoned iron foundry hidden deep in the forest. The crumbling brick structure was overgrown with ivy, its windows shattered and rusted steel girders exposed to the sky. Samuel killed the engine and grabbed a heavy leather duffel bag from under the passenger seat. "We have 40 minutes before they triangulate our backup position," Samuel said, stepping out of the vehicle. "Arthur, grab the tool kit. Marcus, get out." They walked into the cavernous interior of the foundry. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight cutting through the ruined roof. Samuel immediately walked to a workbench buried beneath old tarp, clearing away debris to reveal an array of shortwave radios, soldering irons, and copper wiring. Arthur walked over to his grandfather. "Can you fix it?" "The watch." Samuel picked up a magnifying glass and examined the internal gears. His face grew dark. "The glass isn't the problem. The core crystal, the element that scrambles your signal, is crushed. I don't have another one." Arthur felt a knot form in his stomach. "So what do we do?" "We stop running," Samuel said softly. He looked up at Arthur, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and profound sadness. "I'm an old man, Arthur. I've spent 15 years looking over my shoulder, waiting for this day. I built a system to draw them in. A kill switch for their network." Marcus stepped forward, his fear momentarily replaced by anger. "A kill switch? You brought us to an empty building to fight a small army with some scrap metal?" "No," Samuel replied calmly. "I brought us here because this foundry sits directly on top of an old regional power grid junction. If I can manually overload the transformer downstairs, it will create an localized electromagnetic pulse. It will fry their tracking gear, disable their vehicles, and wipe their digital records of Arthur's signature forever." "And what happens to the person who overloads the transformer?" Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper. Samuel didn't answer. He looked away, focusing on his tools. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise in the cafeteria. Arthur knew his grandfather's silence. It meant there was a catch, a price that someone had to pay. "Grandpa," Arthur repeated, stepping closer. "What happens to the person down there?" "The junction manual release has to be held down by hand for 90 seconds while the capacitors charge," Samuel said quietly. "The feedback will destroy the lower level. Whoever holds that lever isn't coming back up." Marcus backed away, his face pale. "No. No way. I'm not dying in some dirty basement." "Nobody asked you to," Samuel snapped. "This was always my responsibility. I created the system for Meridian. I am going to be the one to destroy it." "No." Arthur shouted, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. "You're all I have. We can run. We can find another place to hide." "There is nowhere left to hide, Arthur," Samuel said gently, placing his calloused hands on Arthur's shoulders. "They have modern satellites now. Within an hour, they will have this entire forest surrounded. This is the only way you get to have a real life. A life where you don't have to wear a cage around your neck. Before Arthur could argue further, the sound of heavy tires crunching on gravel echoed from outside the foundry. Samuel's face hardened instantly. He reached into his duffel bag, pulled out a small handheld radio, and shoved it into Arthur's hands. "They're here. Earlier than I calculated." Through the cracked windows of the foundry, 3 unmarked black SUVs tore through the overgrown weeds surrounding the building. Doors flew open, and 6 armed operatives in full gray tactical gear stepped out, weapons raised. "Arthur, take the stairs to the upper catwalk," Samuel commanded, pointing toward a rusted steel staircase along the back wall. "Marcus, go with him. Stay out of sight. Grandpa, please. Go." Samuel yelled, shoving Arthur toward the stairs just as the front doors of the foundry were blown inward with a flashbang grenade. The deafening boom echoed through the concrete building. White smoke poured into the room. Arthur and Marcus scrambled up the metal stairs, crouching behind a rusted steel beam on the upper catwalk. Below them, Samuel took cover behind a heavy iron workbench. The lead operative stepped through the smoke, his weapon aimed squarely at Samuel. "Samuel Vance. Stand down. Hand over the boy, and your execution will be swift." Samuel didn't flinch. He held a small remote detonator in his left hand. "You're in the wrong place, son. We know the boy is here," the operative said coldly. "His signature led us straight to this grid. You can't protect him anymore." From the catwalk above, Marcus stared down at the armed men. His whole life, Marcus had been the biggest, scariest guy in the room. He had used his size to intimidate kids like Arthur because it made him feel powerful, because it made him feel safe from his own insecurities at home. But looking down at real violence, at men who didn't care about rules or consequences, Marcus realized how small he actually was. He looked at Arthur, who was huddled beside him, tears streaming down his face, holding the broken pieces of his watch in his trembling hand. "Arthur," Marcus whispered, his voice shaking. "Your grandpa, he's really going to do it, isn't he? He's going to sacrifice himself for me," Arthur sobbed quietly. "And it's all my fault." "It's not your fault," Marcus said, the words tasting like lead on his tongue. "It's mine. I threw you on that table. I broke it." Down below, the lead operative took a step toward Samuel. "Where is the boy, Vance?" Samuel raised the remote. "He's already gone." The operative smirked. "Check the lower levels and the roof," he ordered his men. "Leave no corner unsearched." 2 operatives began heading toward the back staircase, the exact staircase leading straight to Arthur and Marcus. Arthur closed his eyes, preparing for the end. But suddenly, Marcus stood up. "Marcus, what are you doing?" Arthur hissed, reaching out to grab his sleeve. Marcus pulled away. For the first time in his life, he didn't look like a bully. He looked terrified, but behind the terror was a desperate, burning desire to undo the damage he had caused. "Hey! Over here, you idiots!" Marcus yelled at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing across the rafters of the foundry. Every weapon below instantly swung upward, aiming at the catwalk. "Marcus, no!" Arthur screamed. Marcus grabbed a loose iron bolt from the floor and hurled it with all his strength at the lead operative, striking him squarely in the chest armor. "Run, Arthur! Go to the basement!" Marcus roared, turning and sprinting in the opposite direction along the catwalk, drawing the attention and gunfire of 3 operatives away from the stairs. Bullets ripped through the corrugated metal walls above as Marcus vaulted over a barrier, leading the men toward the far side of the building. Down below, the distraction gave Samuel the opening he needed. Samuel threw his workbench forward, knocking down the nearest operative, and lunged toward the heavy steel door that led to the transformer basement. "Arthur! Get down here now!" Samuel shouted over the noise of gunfire. Arthur slid down the metal stairs, his boots clattering against the steps, and sprinted through the steel door into the dark, echoing basement just as Samuel slammed it shut behind them, throwing a heavy iron deadbolt into place. The basement was cold, dark, and filled with the low, ominous thrum of high-voltage electrical currents. Massive copper cables ran along the ceiling, feeding into a generator the size of a shipping container. "Grandpa," Marcus drew them away. Arthur cried, breathing heavily. "We have to help him." "Marcus bought us time," Samuel said, his voice strained as he pulled open the heavy circuit panel of the generator. "That boy just showed more courage than I gave him credit for. But if we don't activate this now, his sacrifice means nothing." Samuel grabbed a heavy rubber insulated lever on the side of the transformer. "Listen to me, Arthur. When I pull this, the magnetic field will lock this door from the inside. The surge will travel up through the building. The EMP will fry every radio, vehicle, and satellite receiver within 5 miles. You need to take the rear emergency hatch, get to the river, and head south. I'm not leaving you." Arthur wept, grabbing his grandfather's arm. Samuel looked at his grandson, his eyes softening. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph, pressing it into Arthur's palm. It was a picture of Arthur's mother, smiling in a field of sunflowers. "You look just like her, Arthur," Samuel whispered. "She gave her life to keep you safe from these people. I have spent my whole life making sure her sacrifice wasn't in vain. Don't make me fail her now. Grandpa. You are strong, Arthur. Stronger than you know," Samuel said gently. "Now go. Live a normal life. That's all I ever wanted for you." Above them, heavy thuds rattled the steel basement door. Meridian's men were using explosives to breach the entry. Samuel shoved Arthur toward a small metal ladder leading up to an emergency escape hatch in the corner of the room. "Go." Arthur squeezed the photograph in his fist, looked at his grandfather one last time, and scrambled up the ladder. He pushed open the heavy iron hatch, climbing out into the dense brush behind the foundry. Just as Arthur reached the tree lean, a deafening, humongous roar echoed from beneath the ground. The earth trembled beneath his feet. A brilliant, violet flash of light erupted from the cracks in the foundry's foundation, followed by a shockwave that knocked Arthur to his knees. Instantly, every light, every vehicle engine, and every electronic device in the vicinity went dead. The constant, high-frequency hum that had buzzed in the air since the cafeteria was instantly gone, replaced by an absolute, profound silence. Arthur lay in the dirt, tears streaming down his face, watching smoke billow from the basement vents of the foundry. His grandfather was gone. Minutes passed like hours. Arthur sat paralyzed by grief, holding the photograph of his mother and the shattered metal shell of the watch. Then, a weak cough came from the bushes 50 yards away. Arthur snapped his head around. Crawling through the tall grass, bleeding from a cut on his forehead and clutching his bruised ribs, was Marcus. Arthur ran over to him, helping the larger boy sit up against the trunk of an oak tree. Marcus looked exhausted, battered, and utterly humbled, but he was alive. Did it work?" Marcus rasped, staring back at the silent, darkened foundry. "Yes," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "It worked. Everything is dead." Marcus looked down at his own hands, then up at Arthur. "I'm sorry, man," Marcus whispered, a tear cutting a clean path through the dirt on his cheek. "I am so sorry. I caused all of this." Arthur looked at the broken watch in his hands, then back at Marcus. The anger he expected to feel wasn't there. All that was left was the reality of what had happened, and the realization that Marcus had faced certain death to give him a chance to survive. "You didn't run," Arthur said quietly. "You could have jumped off the catwalk and saved yourself, but you drew them away." "I was a coward my whole life, Arthur," Marcus said, his chest heaving. "I pushed kids around because I thought it made me somebody. But watching your grandpa, seeing what real strength looks like. I couldn't just let them take you. The two boys sat in a quiet forest as the afternoon sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows through the trees. They were from two completely different worlds, one a quiet outcast with a dangerous secret, the other a bully who had lost his way. But sitting in the dirt beside the ruins of the foundry, they were just two kids who had survived the impossible. Together, they walked out of the woods, leaving the shattered pieces of the past behind them. Years later, Arthur would understand that safety isn't found in hiding behind a mask or hanging a shield around your neck. Real safety, and real strength, come from the people who choose to stand by you when the world falls apart. We spend so much of our lives judging people by the damage on their surface, forgetting that inside the most broken places, a person can still choose to be a hero.